Hello, modern world history students. Welcome to class. I snuck this one in before I had to go home I have to take all this stuff home, so I snuck this one in, okay? So here we go. We're going to continue our sort of discussion about the Enlightenment time period and the rise of the problems in France, the French Revolution, how it really gets rolling. We'll see how the philosophes that we discussed last time have something to do with this. So this one's going to be called a short outline of the French Revolution. You need a blank piece of paper. Here we go. All right. So a couple of things that one of the things that you got on your pickup day, hopefully, was this handout, which is called, if you look very carefully, this is called the guillotine game. So I'm going to kind of try to divide this into two parts. I'm going to go through this guillotine game, and then I'm going to do this short outline, which you will write down. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to do a little bit of highlighting along the way. Now the game itself is a fun game. We're going to play this game when we come back to class, which I have faith is exactly what will happen. So try to follow along with me. Here we go. France in the late 1700s was the strongest, most influential country in modern Europe, in Western Europe. And that's very true. However, and they were copied by other nations. They had a lot of things that were very impressive, certainly. I'm going to show you one of those things here in just a moment. Yet violence and disorder swept the country between 1789 and 1799. That's the 10-year period known as the French Revolution, where even the king and queen were beheaded, and this eventually leads to Napoleon Bonaparte. Okay, all right, so here we go. What is the causes? One of the things that I need you to make sure you understand is this concept of estates. And the country of France at this time, so we're talking about the late 1700s, everybody, okay, was divided into three social classes. They were called estates. All right, so here we go. Let's discuss the first estate, and this is really sort of what I want to do here. The first estate, the highest social class, if you will, these were made up of people who were in the clergy. Now, France was Rome, well, it still is, Roman Catholic country. Okay, so if you're a member of the clergy, you were a member of the Roman Catholic Church. You had given your life to the Roman Catholic Church. You were a priest. You could be a priest, but you could be all the way up to an archbishop of all things. Now, here's some things, and again, you can see that this is listed as privileges. All right, so they own 10% of the land. So this is sort of an interesting. This is going to be one of the discussions. That's the problem here is land distribution. So you have 1% of the population controlling 10% of the land. Now, aristocrats, this is a very important word that we keep in mind, and I'm thinking you understand this. This is the nobility. This is the wealthy class. These are people that come from wealth, long-time family wealth. Remember, the nobility is the term that we really use here. And the only way you could become a priest, the only way that you could become eventually an archbishop, the only way you could be one of these things in the Roman Catholic Church is if you came from a wealthy family. Okay? All right, so most members of the upper clergy were rich, lived in nice homes, spent considerable time and money and leisure on activities, entertainment. They ignored their jobs. Here's something that is also going to be an issue. The first estate was not required to pay taxes. Okay, so that was no good. That's a recipe for trouble. Typically, first estate members would donate money to the government to help it be run. These donations were looked upon as, oh, what a nice guy, but never their fair share. And look, let's make sure we understand there were some lower clergy members from the middle class. They were often poor. And yes, there were a lot of good priests out there, good members of the Roman Catholic Church that did do the right things and try to help the regular folks. Okay? The second state is the rest of the nobility. It's the rest of the family members who don't. These wealthy families. These are the men, and obviously all the women at this time. Well, certainly women could become nuns, but these are the rest of the aristocratic families who didn't choose a life in the Roman Catholic Church. They chose to live their life and be whatever, do what they wanted to do with their lives, etc. They held the most important positions in the church, the government, and the army. And this is very important. The only way you could become an officer in the army was if you were an aristocrat. A grunt soldier could never get promoted, and be a general. The only way to become a general in the French army, for example, was to be from an aristocratic family. And these folks, they advised the king. They were given gifts and a pension. Do you know what a pension is? A pension is if you recall, my money talks, I've talked about how pensions are payments to work, people who've worked a whole lifetime, and then pensions are payments after retirement. The second estate, they also paid little or no taxes. That was another issue. They lived on luxurious estates or lived with the king at Versailles. Okay, so here we go. We have to do something here that's very important. You were given a picture with the original handouts. This is going to be your very first picture of the course. And the picture is, here it is, this one right here. Let's start with this picture right here, okay? So, this is the major building in a small town just to the, I believe it's the south and west of Paris itself. We recognize Paris as the capital city of France today. During the time when France was ruled by kings, the kings lived in this small town just outside of town, just outside of the town of Paris called Versailles. Okay, so this is a small portion of the Palace of Versailles. The Palace of Versailles, you were not given this picture, the Palace of Versailles was built really by this man. This man, his name is King Louis XIV. And King Louis XIV was nicknamed the Sun King, okay? And he really was around sort of in the early 1700s, and he sort of completed this big, enormous, humongous, basically what is in essence not necessarily a castle, but it's a palace. And it is super beautiful. So now I took this photograph. I've been fortunate enough. I've gone to Versailles 3 times. And I took that picture right there. Okay? And so here's what I did. I took that photograph and just sort of give you an idea of how big this place is. I took that picture. Let's see if I can work this out. Give me just a second here. I took that picture. That's not it. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay, here it is. Here's a picture of that. Here's a picture of that same Louis XIV statue right there. We're going to get to this if it's the last thing I do. All right, so here, let's just proceed. Okay, so anyway, this palace has huge grounds, and the building is super huge. Now, the reason why I want to show you this is to give you an example of how extravagant this place is. Okay, so you can see that the building, this is sort of the backside of a U-shaped building. Now, do you see this entire, what I would guess would call the second floor? Basically, what you have to understand is that this entire second floor is one room. What do you mean, Mr. O'Brien? Well, this is the most extravagant room in the entire building. This room is called, ready for this? This room is called the Hall of Mirrors, and here it is. Okay, so that's on the back side of your picture, all right? And you can sort of see, oh, it's in this thing. Okay, you can see that these are the windows over here. These are the windows that are basically here. And mirrors were a relatively new invention in the early 1700s. So Louis XIV, the Sun King, he put mirrors on this side, and then the sun would shine in, and you would get all this natural light in here. Now, when you go through this room, and it's obviously super impressive. Here's an even better picture of it if you would like. Take a look at that. That's pretty cool, right? Okay. One of the things you'll discover, and one of the things you'll see, is that on the tour, you always enter from this side. Okay, so apparently Louis XIV did this thing that, you know, when people entered to come see him, he set his throne up at the opposite end. So in other words, people would enter to come see him, and then he would be sitting in his throne on this side. So people would have to walk the length of the Hall of Mirrors to go see him. Now, when you got done, you had to leave the same way you came in. You had to come back
this distance and then leave out that same door. Now the trick is that you were never supposed to turn your back on the king. And apparently Louis XIV had this thing that he liked to do, and that was basically, people, obviously you can't turn your back on them, so you have to walk backwards. So Louis XIV would sit there and he would watch people walk backwards all the way, the whole length of the Hall of Mirrors to leave, and he apparently got a good chuckle out of that, and he certainly enjoyed doing that. Okay, so let's make a couple of notations here. This is, we're going to call this the Hall of Mirrors. Make a note of that, Hall of Mirrors. Okay, and then on this side we're going to say Palace of Versailles. I found that picture I wanted to show you. Here it is. Okay, I took this, basically I took this photograph right here. Here is the actual photograph itself. Okay, I took this photograph, and so what I turned 180 degrees after taking that picture, and I took this picture. And you can see how humongous these grounds are. Okay, so there's a big fountain right here called the Fountain of the Frogs. There's a big fountain right here called the Big Neptune Fountain. Okay, and all of these things, this was basically so big it was hunting grounds for all the kings of the time period. Okay, all right, so let's get back to our discussion. That's Versailles. Nobles who owned estates had peasants working for them. Does that sound familiar? That sounds to me, remember what that sounds like? That sounds like feudalism. Remember that discussion, feudalism from the Middle Ages? Having serfs do work. Okay? Nobles did little of the work, dressed in the latest fashion, spent most of their time enjoying the good life. Here's some other factoids. The Second Estate owned 20% of the land. They were only 1% of the French population. So again, you can see this is a very difficult issue. Okay, this is the same kind of thing. This is going to be a little bit no taxes, a lot of land, same as the First Estate. All right, so here we go to the third side. You can see that they do not get privileges. The Third Estate has complaints. Basically, the Third Estate's everybody else. Okay, so now the king at this time is Louis XIV, the Sun King's grandson, a guy named Louis XVI. All right, and basically the complaints are adding up. And basically what they were saying is the king refuses to make needed reforms. He lives down there in Versailles. He's not in town. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't realize what all the people of France really need. Here we have the philosophes. So the representatives of the Third Estate said the ideas of the philosophes were good. Let's get them going, and let's get them, make them the basis of the French government. I think this is interesting. Again, when we talk about this, we're talking about roughly, we sort of associate the French Revolution with the year 1789. Of course, this is 13 years after the American Revolution in 1776, and the French were very much influenced by the American Declaration of Independence. And they basically said, these leaders of the Third Estate said, this document has a lot of stuff that we like. Okay? Letter D, the church and nobility, the upper estates do not deserve special privileges. Many peasants do not have enough to eat. Clergymen and nobles do not have to pay taxes. This puts the burden of taxation on the Third Estate, and I've made my point about taxation several times to you all, about how taxation, raising taxes, and taxation generally always falls upon the lower class, even when you try to tax the upper classes. It is not right to have a group of lazy, rich people living in the same country as hardworking, regular folks. Okay? It is not fair that all these things go to aristocratic families only. Okay? All right, so then let's just sort of, I mean, this is not very difficult. I think that you can kind of go through these 4 questions right up here and be pretty easily figure them out. Okay? Why would the First and Second Estate support Louis XVI, who, like previous French kings, was an absolute monarch ruling by divine right? This is not difficult, is it? They would support that because they had a good deal, didn't they? The way it was set up benefited the First and Second Estates. Okay? Why would they want change? They benefited from it. The Third Estate wanted France to have a government like England. In England, Parliament limited the power of the king, and people enjoyed many rights and freedoms. What is the difference between an absolute monarchy, which France had, and a limited monarchy, which England had? I'll give you 2 words, ladies and gentlemen. Magna Carta. Remember the Magna Carta in England? So the Magna Carta was a document signed in 1215. Okay, we're talking about 550 plus years before the French Revolution, in which the English nobility basically said the king's out of control. The king is arbitrary. The king is whimsical. All right, so we're going to write a document that limits his power. Whereas in France, he still had absolute power. King, all these Louis had absolute power going on. If you were a member of the third estate, how would you feel about the system of taxation? Well, this isn't hard either, is it? It would be terrible. You would hate it because obviously the burden of taxation falls upon those least able to deal with it. As a French citizen of third estate, would you be satisfied with the land ownership? Probably not. Certainly there is a lot of land ownership because 70% of the land is still left over for this 98% of the population. Yeah, I think some people probably benefited. There are some members of the third estate that were okay, that didn't necessarily have problems with it. But I think generally this was another thing that the people of France could get after the whole system about. Okay, so all right, let's go through. So that's the end of part one. If you would like to take a little break, you can stop your video and you can sort of continue after your brief break. How's that sound? But I am going to proceed right now with the short outline, and very often students joke that, Mr. O'Brien, you think everything is short, and then once you get going, it's not really that short. And that may be true about me, I have to admit. Okay, so here we go. A short outline of the French Revolution. Here we go. Number one. Well, as I've stated, regardless of who thinks what, a lot of people in France, the vast majority of people in France, thought that the class system, the estates system, was unfair. And I think there's certainly an argument right there. And really, the problem with it was there was no class mobility. If you were in the third estate, you were stuck. Even if you were a professional and were wealthy, there were wealthy third estaters, but you were never considered part of the elites. Okay? You could never really be considered as really one of the top people in the country of France. All right, so here we go. Next, the philosophes are very important in this whole thing. The philosophes inspired third estaters. And the third estate are going to be led by, in their representation, educated men. And these educated men had read the stuff of the philosophes. All right? Here's one of the things we're going to discover is that France was actually broke. And there are several reasons. Number one, the French treasury was broke because of extravagant living. Maintaining a palace like Versailles is not cheap. And apparently, especially Louis XVI's reign, there was a lot of partying going on, a lot of very expensive parties happening that were using up a lot of money of the French treasury. Did you know that the French also supported foreign wars? Now, the historical enemy of the French is England. Okay, so can you think of a foreign war that the French would be involved with that was anti-Great Britain? Well, I mean, you may be able to figure this out. It was the American Revolution. If you know anything about the American Revolution, you know that France was the United States' main ally in their quest for independence from the British. And the fact of the matter is, this is not that long before what we're talking about here in France. That's when the American Revolution was going on. And the French did spend a lot of money because they believed it would weaken their traditional enemy, England, the British Empire. And so now let's continue. What happens? Well, Louis XVI tries to get things turned around. Louis XVI was not considered necessarily the most clever guy. He was not necessarily considered the most on-it guy. He was not a great leader. He was forced into leadership because he was part of the family that was the royal family. He was not considered a strong personality. Apparently a super nice guy. Just sort of a regular dude. Not necessarily interested even in becoming king, but he was part of the king, had to be king. So what is interesting about this is that he tries to sort of change the system. He actually supports the third estate. However, the first and second estate, realizing that he's not a very strong personality, they basically say, no, we're not going to listen to you. We're not going to pay our fair share of taxes. And in fact, what we really want is we want more of a role in government. We demand more of a say in what's going on in France. Okay, now as you might imagine, the third estate is not happy about this, and so the representatives, and there's representative meetings here, the representatives from the third estate demand something that is in France's constitution, and it's called the Estates Générales, the Estates General. And this was basically a body of representatives that would come together to represent the three estates. And it's not just three guys, it's hundreds of guys that were going to discuss what was going on in France. And so this thing is called for the first time since 1614. Like I said, it's now 1789. And basically they would have discussions and they would argue and they would try to debate and they would try to come up with some solutions for the country. The problem with the Estates General historically before 1614 and again in 1789 was each estate had one vote. So guess what the final vote usually was? 2-1. And as you might imagine, the two upper estates would vote against the third estate. And that was the problem. Each estate had one vote. Okay, now, one day, the Estates General was meeting, and the representatives of the third estate were having another meeting earlier on in the day, in the morning. And when they arrived at the Estates General meeting place, meeting hall, if you will, they discovered that the door was locked, and they were locked out. And the first and second estate said, "We are moving on without you." This is probably not a good idea. The third estate, the representatives of the third estate are furious. They're absolutely angry, and they look for a place to go meet. And the only place they can find where they can all fit, where they can have an emergency meeting, is what was at that time called a tennis court. And they take this sort of weird thing. It's more like, probably more like a, I don't know, racquetball. I think you hit it from the same side. I don't think you hit it across the net. But the oath of the tennis court is what they called it. And at the oath of the tennis court, the representatives of the third estate promised each other that they would create a new assembly called the National Assembly, which they did, and that they would write a constitution. Okay? And remember now, 1789 is what we're talking about here. Guess what was just written 2 years earlier in the United States? The United States Constitution. So again, you have this influence of the United States on this thing that's happening. The most important event of the French Revolution happened on July 14th, 1789. This is what they call their Independence Day. July 4th is Independence Day in the United States. Here's a good trip for you. You go to July 4th in, say, Boston or Washington, D.C. or New York City or some big city like that. And then fly over, when this is available, fly over to Europe and make sure you're in France on the 14th, and you can have a second celebration of independence. They call it Bastille Day. And what happened was that the peasants of the city stormed this big, what was in essence a fortress. And it was also a prison. Now, it's kind of interesting and kind of strange, but guess what was always kept in the prison? Gunpowder. Now, I know that's kind of odd and kind of strange sounding, but that's exactly what was stored there. That's why the peasants stormed this building. And they literally ripped this building down. It was a big stone building. They tore it down, tore it to the ground, starting on this particular day. This is a symbolic gesture, certainly, but it was one of the more important ones. Okay, so what does now Louis do? Louis agrees to try to work with the National Assembly. Louis, again, is trying to work this out. But Louis is sort of fighting a battle that he is not going to be able to win because this is going in a particular direction. And the National Assembly creates something called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. That sort of sounds like the Declaration of Independence, does it? And when you read the two documents next to each other, they are similar in many ways. Okay? Here's where it gets interesting. The neighboring countries of Prussia and Austria, they declare war on the revolutionary government of France. Now, why would the King of Prussia and why would the King of Austria declare war on the revolutionary government of France? Well, I think you could probably figure this out. What do the King of Austria and the King of Prussia see happening and they didn't love Louis XVI by any stretch of the imagination, but what did they see happening to a king, like literally in the country right next door? Well, they saw a king losing power. And so these kings feared democratic revolutions in their own country. So they have to try to squash this democratic revolution that's happening in their neighbor. Because of this, the people of Paris turn on Louis XVI. And part of this is that Louis had a wife who was Louis's wife. Her name was Marie Antoinette. She was from Austria. And Louis and his wife and his kids, they actually try to make a run for it. They try to escape to Austria. And he's captured and he's brought to Paris. And he is eventually, he and his wife, for that matter, are both eventually beheaded. Because they represent dictatorship. They represent absolutism. They represent this oligarchic rule of the elites. They represent the first estate. Okay? So you can see that this is getting chaotic. This begins a time period called the Reign of Terror, which I've talked to you about in political spectrum number 2. Okay? Political spectrum number 2. The Reign of Terror. This was led by a man named Maximilien Robespierre. And he was very serious about all of this stuff, and he was, as we get into more of a discussion of politics, we'll come back to Robespierre and we'll talk about him in more detail. He was very serious about changing the situation in his home country. He was a third estater, but he was a well-educated lawyer. And Maximilien Robespierre was the recognized leader of the National Assembly and eventually the Reign of Terror. However, even his fellow members of the Third Estate recognized that he was a little out of control himself. And so they turn on him, and this is what I'm talking about. They turn on him, and he gets beheaded. And now we have my favorite old word, right? My favorite word, anarchy. Okay? Anarchy. It's out of control. There's brutal murder of all kinds of different people, men, women, and children, priests, all kinds of different people. Okay? And what is the main way people were killed? Well, they were killed by, ladies and gentlemen, they were killed by the guillotine. Now, if you don't know what a guillotine is, there's a crude drawing in the back of this thing that can show you what a guillotine looks like. So take a look at that. Okay? All right, everybody. I think that you can guess who this strong leader is going to end up being. That'll be our next discussion. Okay, everyone? All right, very good. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Aloha.